Harold Jenkins was not the kind of man who drew attention to himself. At 72 years old, he had spent most of his life living quietly, doing what he thought was right without expecting much in return. Every day, rain or shine, he would set up his little stand on the corner of Elm Street and Fifth Avenue. It wasn't much, just a wooden table with a faded cloth draped over it, but it held something Harold believed was important: American flags. To Harold, these flags were more than pieces of fabric stitched together. They were symbols of pride, unity, and hope. He had started selling them years ago after retiring from his job as a school janitor. Selling flags gave him purpose, a reason to get out of bed every morning. But lately, things had changed. Few people stopped to buy his flags anymore. Most just walked by, glancing at him briefly before turning away. Some even laughed. On this particular afternoon, Harold stood alone behind his stand, watching the world go by. The sun hung low in the sky, painting everything in shades of orange and gold. The air smelled faintly of freshly cut grass and car exhaust. Harold adjusted his faded red baseball cap and sighed. Business had been slow all week, and today didn't look any different. His loyal dog, Max, lay at his feet. Max was a golden retriever with shaggy fur that seemed to match Harold's own untidy appearance. The dog let out a soft whine, sensing his owner's sadness. Harold reached down and scratched Max behind the ears. "Don't worry, boy," he said softly. "We'll be okay." Just then, a group of teenagers approached. They were loud, their voices carrying easily across the empty street. One of them, a tall boy with messy hair and a hoodie, pointed at Harold's stand and snickered. "Look at this guy," the boy said, nudging his friends. "Still trying to sell those dumb flags?" The others laughed, and Harold felt his cheeks grow warm. He tried to ignore them, focusing instead on arranging the flags neatly on the table. But the boy, whose name was Kyle, wasn't done. He stepped closer, his sneakers scuffing against the pavement. "Hey, old man," Kyle called out. "Why don't you give up already? Nobody cares about your stupid flags." Harold clenched his fists but forced himself to stay calm. He'd heard insults like this before, though they never got easier to take. "These aren't just stupid flags," he replied, his voice steady despite the anger bubbling inside him. "They mean something. Maybe if you took the time to understand, you'd see that." Kyle rolled his eyes dramatically. "Yeah, sure, whatever you say." Then with a smirk, he grabbed an empty soda can from his pocket and threw it at the stand. It bounced off the edge of the table, knocking several flags onto the ground. The other teens erupted into laughter, clapping each other on the back as if they'd accomplished something great. Max growled low in his throat, raising his head to glare at the intruders. Harold quickly placed a hand on the dog's neck to keep him calm. "It's all right, Max," he murmured. "Let it go." Once the teenagers had moved on, still laughing and jeering, Harold bent down to pick up the fallen flags. Each one was slightly crumpled now, the edges dusty from skidding across the pavement. He brushed them off carefully, treating them with the same respect he always did. To Harold, these flags deserved better than being treated like trash. As he worked, he couldn't help but notice a black SUV parked a short distance away. It had been there for hours, its dark windows hiding whoever sat inside. Harold glanced at it occasionally, wondering why it hadn't moved. Was someone watching him? The thought made him uneasy, but he shook it off. Probably just some tourist, taking a break, he told himself. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the street, Harold decided it was time to pack up. He folded the cloth covering the table and tucked it into a worn backpack. Then he gathered the remaining flags, stacking them neatly before securing them with bungee cords. Max stood up, wagging his tail as if eager to leave. "Come on, boy," Harold said, picking up the leash attached to Max's collar. "Let's go home." They walked slowly, Harold's legs aching from standing all day. As they turned onto a quieter street, he glanced back toward the corner where his stand usually sat. For a moment, he thought he saw movement near the black SUV. Squinting, he tried to make out details, but the vehicle remained still, its windows reflecting the dim glow of a nearby street lamp. Harold shook his head, dismissing the strange feeling creeping up his spine. He tightened his grip on Max's leash and continued walking. Little did he know that black SUV and the person inside it would soon change his life forever. That night, as Harold sat in his small apartment, sipping a cup of tea and petting Max, he allowed himself to reflect on the day. The laughter of the teenagers echoed in his mind, making him feel smaller than he already was. Yet deep down, he knew he hadn't done anything wrong. Selling flags wasn't about money or recognition. It was about sharing something he believed. And still Harold couldn't shake the image of the black SUV from his thoughts. Something about it felt off. Who could have been sitting inside? And why had they stayed so long? These questions lingered unanswered as Harold drifted off to sleep, unaware of the extraordinary events waiting just around the corner. For now, though, all he could do was hold on to hope. That tomorrow might bring brighter days and maybe, just maybe, someone would finally appreciate the flags he worked so hard to share. The next evening, Harold found himself back at his usual spot on Elm Street. Despite yesterday's humiliation, he had decided to set up his stand again. It was what he did every day, after all. Selling flags wasn't just a habit. It was part of who he was. Harold believed that even if no one else cared about the flags, he owed it to himself to keep going. Max stayed close by his side, occasionally wagging his tail when someone walked past. But most people ignored them completely. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, painting the clouds orange and pink. Harold leaned against his table, watching the world go by. His mind kept wandering back to the black SUV he'd noticed earlier. Was it still there? He hadn't seen it today, but the memory of its presence lingered like an unanswered question. Just as Harold started packing up for the day, he heard the low rumble of an engine. Turning around, he saw the same black SUV pulling up alongside, the curb. Its headlights were off, blending it into the shadows of the fading light. Harold froze, his heart skipping a beat. Who could this be? Why were they here? The driver's side door opened slowly, and a man stepped out. Harold squinted, trying to make out the figure in the dim light. Then, as the man moved closer, Harold's eyes widened in disbelief. It was Chuck Norris. Chuck wore a simple leather jacket over a plain white t-shirt, along with dark jeans and sturdy boots. His presence commanded respect without needing words. As he approached Harold, his expression remained calm and focused. There was nothing flashy or intimidating about him, just quiet confidence. "Harold Jenkins?" Chuck asked, his voice deep and steady. Harold nodded, too stunned to speak. What could Chuck Norris possibly want with him? Yes, Harold stammered finally. "That's me." Chuck offered a small smile, putting Harold slightly at ease. "I've been watching you," he said simply. Harold blinked, unsure how to respond. "Watching me for how long?" "A while now," Chuck replied. "You sell those flags every day, don't you?" "Yes." Harold trailed off, feeling uneasy. Did this mean trouble? Had he done something wrong? Chuck gestured toward the flags on Harold's table. "Those aren't ordinary flags, Harold, not anymore." Harold frowned, confusion mixing with suspicion. "What do you mean? They're just regular American flags. I buy them from a supplier downtown." Chuck shook his head. "They used to be ordinary. But something happened recently. Something big. Those flags are connected to technology far beyond anything we've ever seen before." Harold stared at him, struggling to process what he was hearing. Technology? Connected to my flags? He glanced down at the stack of flags on his table, then back at Chuck. "That doesn't make any sense." "It does," Chuck insisted. "And that's why I'm here. Someone or something is after these flags, and they'll stop at nothing to get them." Harold felt a chill run down his spine. "Who would want my flags? Nobody even buys them." "They're not interested in buying them," Chuck explained patiently. "These flags contain patterns encoded with information, an ancient alien artifact embedded within their design. Whoever deciphers the code can unlock interdimensional travel. Imagine the power that holds." Harold blinked rapidly, trying to wrap his head around the idea. Aliens? Interdimensional travel? It sounded like something out of a science fiction movie. "Are you serious?" he asked weakly. "I am," Chuck said firmly. "And I need your help to protect them." For a moment, Harold didn't know whether to laugh or cry. This whole situation seemed absurd. Yet standing there facing Chuck Norris, the legendary martial artist and actor, made it hard to dismiss outright. If anyone could convince him aliens were real, it was probably Chuck Norris. "But why me?" Harold asked, shaking his head. "I'm just an old man selling flags. I don't know anything about aliens or whatever else you're talking about." "You may not realize it," Chuck said, "but you've already played a key role. By keeping these flags safe, you've unknowingly protected humanity from forces that could destroy us." Harold looked down at Max, who sat quietly beside him, gazing up with trusting eyes. Could it really be true? Was he somehow involved in something bigger than himself? Before Harold could respond, a loud screech of tires broke the silence. Both men turned sharply toward the sound. A sleek black van had pulled up behind the SUV, its doors sliding open. Several men dressed in dark suits jumped out, holding strange devices that glowed faintly in the dusk. Chuck immediately stepped in front of Harold, shielding him. "Stay behind me," he instructed. "We're running out of time." Harold clutched Max's leash tightly, his heart pounding. "Who are they?" he whispered. "They work for Vale Corp," Chuck replied grimly. "A shadowy organization that will stop at nothing to control the gateway." Without another word, Chuck charged forward, moving faster than Harold thought possible. In seconds, he disarmed two of the men with swift, precise movements. Another lunged at him, only to be met with a powerful roundhouse kick that sent him sprawling onto the pavement. Harold watched in awe as Chuck took on the attackers single-handedly. Max barked loudly, adding his own contribution to the chaos. One of the men aimed a glowing device at Chuck, but before he could fire, Chuck deflected it with a spinning kick, sending the weapon flying into the bushes. Seeing their comrades fall, the remaining attackers hesitated. Seizing the opportunity, Chuck grabbed Harold's arm. "Come on," he shouted. "We need to move." Still clutching Max's leash, Harold stumbled after Chuck, adrenaline pushing him forward despite his age. They sprinted down the street, leaving the skirmish behind. Behind them, the attackers regrouped, shouting orders as they gave chase. "Where are we going?" Harold panted, struggling to keep up. "To somewhere safe," Chuck replied, glancing over his shoulder. "Don't worry, I won't let anything happen to you or Max." As they ran, Harold couldn't help but marvel at the absurdity of it all. Just hours ago, he'd been mocked for selling flags. Now he was being pursued by mysterious agents because of those very same flags. Life had a funny way of turning things upside down. Finally, they reached a narrow alleyway where a motorcycle was parked. Chuck hopped onto it effortlessly and handed Harold a spare helmet. "Get on," he said. "We'll lose them this way." Harold hesitated, staring at the bike. "I haven't ridden one of these since I was a kid." "You'll be fine," Chuck assured him. "Just hold on tight." With some effort, Harold climbed on behind Chuck, wrapping his arms cautiously around the man's waist. Max whimpered, clearly unhappy about being left behind, but Chuck promised to come back for him once they were safe. Reluctantly, Harold urged Max to stay put, patting the dog gently on the head. Revving the engine, Chuck sped off into the night, weaving through streets and alleys with practiced ease. The attacker's van roared in pursuit, but Chuck's skillful driving soon left them far behind. As they rode further away from danger, Harold allowed himself a brief moment of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this bizarre turn of events would lead to something greater. After all, if Chuck Norris believed in him, perhaps there was more to Harold Jenkins than he'd ever imagined. After what felt like hours of riding through twisting streets and narrow alleys, Chuck finally slowed the motorcycle and pulled into an old, abandoned parking garage. The place was dark and silent, except for the faint buzzing of flickering fluorescent lights overhead. Dust covered every surface, and the air smelled musty like it hadn't been disturbed in years. Harold climbed off the bike stiffly, his legs aching from the ride. He removed the helmet and handed it back to Chuck, who set it aside without a word. Max, who had stayed behind near the alley where they'd escaped, trotted up now, wagging his tail anxiously. Harold knelt down to pet him, relief washing over him at the sight of his faithful companion. "Where are we?" Harold asked, looking around the empty space. "A safe house," Chuck replied simply. "For now." Before Harold could ask more, "Questions?" a voice called out from deeper within the garage. "You made it." A young woman stepped forward, carrying a laptop under her arm. She looked to be in her late 20s, with short brown hair and glasses perched on her nose. Her clothes were practical, a plain hoodie and jeans, but there was an air of intelligence about her. She introduced herself as Rachel. "I've been tracking those guys since you left the corner," she said, nodding toward Harold. "They're persistent, I'll give them that. And dangerous," added another voice. A man emerged from the shadows, tall and broad-shouldered, with a weathered face and a noticeable scar running along his jawline. He wore a leather jacket and boots, giving him a no-nonsense appearance. His name was Daniel, and he carried himself like someone who had seen too much but still refused to back down. "This is our team," Chuck explained, gesturing to Rachel and Daniel. "We've been working together to stop Veilcorp. Now, thanks to you, Harold, we have a chance to finish the job." Harold blinked, overwhelmed by everything happening so fast. "Finish what job? What exactly am I supposed to do?" Rachel opened her laptop and turned the screen toward Harold. On it was a close-up image of one of his flags. At first glance, it looked ordinary, but as Rachel zoomed in, strange patterns became visible within the stars and stripes. They weren't random. They formed intricate designs that almost seemed to pulse with energy. "These patterns are encoded with coordinates," Rachel explained. "Not just any coordinates, ones that lead to a gateway between dimensions. Whoever controls this gateway can travel anywhere, anytime. Imagine the chaos if the wrong people get their hands on it." Harold stared at the screen, his mind racing. "But how did these codes end up on my flags? I didn't put them there." "No, you didn't," Chuck said. "Someone else did, someone far older and smarter than us. The flags themselves are remnants of an ancient alien artifact. Somehow they ended up in your supplier's inventory, and you unknowingly started selling them." Daniel crossed his arms, his expression grim. "Veilcorp figured it out before we did. That's why they've been after you. But they don't know all the details yet. We need to stay ahead of them." Harold rubbed his temples, feeling a headache coming on. This was all too much to take in. "So, what happens now? What do you expect me to do?" "You're already doing it," Rachel said with a small smile. "By keeping the flags safe, you've protected humanity from disaster. Now we need your help to decode the rest of the patterns. Your knowledge of history and symbols might hold the key." Harold frowned. "My knowledge? I'm just an old man who likes flags. I don't know anything special." "That's not true," Chuck said firmly. "You've spent years studying these symbols, even if you didn't realize it. Trust me, Harold, you're more valuable than you think." Feeling both flattered and terrified, Harold nodded slowly. "All right, if you say so, I'll try." Over the next few hours, the group worked tirelessly. Rachel typed away on her laptop, running algorithms to analyze the flag patterns. Daniel cleaned and prepared weapons, ensuring they were ready for whatever came next. Chuck kept watch near the entrance, occasionally stepping outside to scan the area for signs of trouble. Harold sat at a makeshift table, surrounded by stacks of flags. With Rachel's guidance, he examined each one closely, pointing out subtle differences in design that might correspond to specific codes. It was slow, painstaking work, but Harold found himself strangely energized. For the first time in years, he felt useful, not mocked or ignored, but genuinely needed. Max lay nearby, watching over everyone with quiet loyalty. Occasionally, he'd lift his head and bark softly, as if encouraging Harold to keep going. As midnight approached, Rachel let out a triumphant cry. "Got it!" she exclaimed, spinning her laptop around to show the others. On the screen was a map overlaid with glowing lines connecting various points. "These are the coordinates. If we follow them, we can find the gateway." Chuck studied the map carefully. "It leads to the mountains," he said. Remote, difficult terrain. Perfect for hiding something this important. Daniel nodded. We'll need supplies and a plan. Veilcorp won't give up easily. Just then, a loud crash echoed through the garage. Everyone froze, their heads snapping toward the entrance. Shadows moved outside, accompanied by the sound of heavy footsteps. Someone, or something, was coming. They found us, Chuck muttered, grabbing a nearby flashlight. Everyone, stay calm, we've got this. Rachel quickly packed up her laptop while Daniel armed himself with a rifle. Harold stood frozen, unsure what to do. Max growled low in his throat, sensing the danger. Chuck turned to Harold, his gaze steady. Stay close to me. And remember, you're braver than you think. The tension in the room was palpable as the first figure appeared in the doorway. Dressed in black tactical gear, the intruder raised a weapon, aiming directly at the group. Without hesitation, Chuck sprang into action, moving faster than Harold thought possible. In seconds, the attacker was disarmed, crumpling to the ground with a groan. More figures poured in, surrounding them. Daniel fired warning shots, forcing the attackers to retreat momentarily. Rachel ducked behind a pillar, clutching her laptop protectively. Harold clung to Max, his heart pounding wildly. Through the chaos, Chuck fought with precision and skill, taking down each opponent with ease. Watching him, Harold couldn't help but feel a spark of admiration. This wasn't just some actor playing a role, this was a real hero. Finally, the last attacker fell and silence returned to the garage. Breathing heavily, Chuck signaled for everyone to gather their things. We need to move now. With no time to waste, the group hurried toward a waiting van parked outside. Daniel drove, while Rachel navigated using the map on her laptop. Chuck sat in the passenger seat, keeping watch through the window. Harold and Max huddled in the back, still trying to process everything that had happened. As the van sped away into the night, Harold glanced at the stack of flags beside him. These simple pieces of fabric had brought him nothing but ridicule for years. Yet now they held the fate of the world in their threads. Whatever lay ahead, Harold knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't let anyone take them without a fight. The van sped through winding mountain roads, the headlights cutting through the thick fog that blanketed everything. Harold sat quietly in the back, clutching one of his flags like it was a lifeline. Max rested his head on Harold's lap, sensing his owner's anxiety. Despite the danger they were in, Harold couldn't shake the feeling that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Up front, Rachel kept her eyes glued to the laptop screen, occasionally giving directions to Daniel, who drove with steady hands. Chuck sat beside him, scanning the road ahead and the rearview mirror for any sign of pursuit. So far, they'd managed to lose Veilcorp's agents after escaping the garage, but none of them believed they were truly safe yet. We're close, Rachel said finally, pointing to a cluster of coordinates on the map. The gateway should be somewhere near an old mining site. It's remote enough to hide something big. Good, Chuck replied. But we need to prepare. They'll catch up sooner or later. Daniel nodded grimly. Let's find a place to hole up and set some traps. If they want to fight, we'll give them one. A short while later, they arrived at an abandoned warehouse nestled deep in the mountains. Its rusted metal walls creaked in the wind, and broken windows let in slivers of moonlight. Inside, the air smelled of dust and decay. Old machinery lay scattered around, covered in cobwebs and grime. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. This will work, Chuck said, surveying the space. We can fortify it and make it hard for them to get in. While Daniel began setting up defenses, rigging tripwires, positioning makeshift barriers, and arming himself, Rachel worked on decoding more of the flag patterns. She hoped to uncover additional clues about the gateway before Veilcorp could piece it together themselves. Harold stayed close by, helping wherever he could. At first, he felt useless, unsure how he could contribute to such a high-stakes mission. But Chuck reminded him of his unique role. You know these flags better than anyone, he told Harold. Keep studying them. There might be something we missed. Encouraged, Harold spread the flags out on a dusty table and examined them carefully. Max stayed by his side, occasionally nudging him gently as if to say, "You've got this." As Harold studied the intricate designs, He noticed subtle variations he hadn't seen before, tiny marks hidden within the stars and stripes. He pointed them out to Rachel, who quickly jotted down notes. "These could be access codes," she said excitedly. "If we can match them to the coordinates, we might be able to activate the gateway safely." As the hours passed, the team worked tirelessly, transforming the decrepit warehouse into a fortress. By the time dawn broke, they had rigged alarms, set traps, and prepared weapons. Exhausted but ready, they took turns keeping watch while others rested. It wasn't long before their preparations were put to the test. Just after sunrise, Max's ears perked up, and he let out a low growl. Harold looked toward the entrance, where faint shadows moved outside the cracked windows. ValeCorp had found them. "They're here," Harold whispered, his voice trembling. Chuck stood up, calm and focused. "Everyone stay sharp, remember the plan." The first wave of attackers came cautiously, armed with glowing devices that emitted strange pulses of energy. They triggered one of the tripwires almost immediately, causing a loud clang as part of the machinery toppled over. Startled, several agents backed away, giving Daniel and Chuck the chance to strike. Chuck moved like lightning, disarming 2 agents with swift kicks and punches. Daniel fired warning shots, forcing the rest to retreat. Momentarily, meanwhile, Rachel hacked into one of the fallen agent's devices, attempting to disable its tracking system. Harold watched in awe as the team fought back against overwhelming odds. He wanted to help, but didn't know how. Then Max barked sharply, drawing Harold's attention to a group of agents sneaking around the side of the building. Without thinking, Harold grabbed a nearby wrench and hurled it at a stack of metal barrels, creating a loud distraction. The agents froze, giving Chuck and Daniel time to intercept them. "You did good, Harold," Chuck said with a nod when the skirmish ended. "Every little bit helps." Despite their efforts, ValeCorp kept coming. Wave after wave of agents pushed forward, forcing the team deeper into the warehouse. The traps slowed them down, but not enough. It was only a matter of time before they breached the defenses completely. That's when tragedy struck. During a particularly fierce attack, Daniel stepped in front of Rachel to shield her from a blast of energy. The impact knocked him off his feet, leaving him bleeding heavily. Rachel rushed to his side, tears streaming down her face as she tried to stop the bleeding. "No," Harold shouted, feeling a surge of anger and grief. These people had become his friends, his family. He couldn't let them suffer because of him. With newfound determination, Harold grabbed one of the flags and held it aloft. "I won't let you take this," he yelled at the advancing agents. "You'll have to go through me first." To everyone's surprise, the flag began to glow faintly, its encoded patterns shimmering with light. Rachel gasped, realizing what was happening. "Harold, you're activating it," she exclaimed. "Keep holding it steady." Chuck quickly ushered Rachel and Max to safety, while Harold stood his ground, the glowing flag acting as a barrier between him and the attackers. The agents hesitated, unsure how to counteract the sudden display of power. Then, with a deafening roar, the ground beneath the warehouse began to tremble. A massive rift opened in the center of the room, swirling with otherworldly colors and energy. The gateway had been activated. ValeCorp's leader, Victor Kane, a cold, calculating man with piercing eyes, emerged from the chaos, aiming a device directly at Harold. "Step aside, old man," he snarled. "This doesn't concern you. It concerns everyone." Harold shot back, his voice firm despite the fear coursing through him. Before Kane could react, Chuck delivered a legendary roundhouse kick that sent the weapon flying out of his hand. The force of the blow knocked Kane backward, giving Harold and the others precious seconds to regroup. "We need to seal the gateway," Rachel shouted. "If we don't, ValeCorp will use it to wreak havoc across dimensions." Chuck turned to Harold. "Can you hold it steady long enough for us to finish the process?" Harold nodded, gripping the flag tightly. "I'll do whatever it takes." With the gateway fully open, the team worked frantically to input the final codes. Max barked encouragement, staying close to Harold as the energy around them grew stronger. Outside, ValeCorp's remaining forces gathered, desperate to break through. Finally, Rachel hit the last key on her laptop. "It's done," she cried. "The gateway is sealing itself." As the rift began to collapse inward, Chuck and Rachel ushered Harold and Max toward the exit. But just as they reached the doorway, Kane lunged at them, his eyes blazing with fury. "You think you've won?" he spat. "This isn't over." Chuck stepped in front of Kane, blocking his path. "Oh, I think it is." With one swift motion, Chuck delivered another devastating kick that sent Kane tumbling into the collapsing gateway. As the portal closed behind him, Kane disappeared into the void, his screams fading into silence. Breathing heavily, the team stumbled out of the warehouse just as it imploded, consumed by the residual energy of the gateway. For a moment, no one spoke. They simply stood there, watching the dust settle over the ruins. "Well," Chuck said finally, breaking the silence. "That was close." Harold sank to his knees, overwhelmed by exhaustion and emotion. Max licked his face, whining softly. Rachel knelt beside him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You saved us all, Harold. We couldn't have done it without you." Chuck walked over and extended a hand, pulling Harold to his feet. "You proved today that even the quietest among us can change the world. Don't ever forget that." As the sun rose over the mountains, casting its warm light over the landscape, Harold realized something important. He wasn't just an old man selling flags anymore. He was a hero, and nothing could take that away from him. The group stood silently on the edge of the cliff, overlooking the remnants of the dimensional gateway. It still hovered in the air, a swirling mass of light and energy that seemed alive, pulsing like a heartbeat. The portal was unstable now, its edges flickering as if fighting to stay open. Harold knew what had to be done. If they left it unchecked, Veil Corp, or worse, could find a way to reopen it and unleash chaos across dimensions. Rachel checked her laptop one last time, confirming the calculations she had been working on since sunrise. "We can seal it permanently," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But someone has to stay behind to make sure the process finishes." Harold didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, clutching the glowing flag tightly in his hands. "I'll do it," he said firmly. Chuck frowned, shaking his head. "No, Harold, you've already done enough. Let me handle this." "No," Harold replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "This started with me. Those flags brought us here, and I'm the one who understands them best. Besides..." He paused, glancing at Max, who sat loyally by his side. "I've lived my life. You all still have so much ahead of you." Rachel's eyes filled with tears and she looked away, unable to meet Harold's gaze. Even Daniel, who rarely showed emotion, clenched his fists, his jaw tight. They all knew Harold was right, but that didn't make it any easier to accept. Chuck placed a hand on Harold's shoulder, his expression unreadable. "You're braver than most people I've ever met," he said quietly. "If this is your choice, we won't stop you. But remember, you're not just some old man selling flags. You're a hero." Harold smiled faintly, feeling a lump rise in his throat. For years he'd felt invisible, mocked and ignored by the world. Now, standing here with these people who believed in him, he finally understood his worth. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." Max whined softly, nudging Harold's leg with his nose. Harold knelt down, wrapping his arms around the dog's neck. "Take care of him, Chuck," he said, his voice breaking. "He's been my best friend through all of this." Chuck nodded solemnly. "I promise." With a deep breath, Harold turned, back toward the gateway. Rachel handed him a small device connected to her laptop, explaining how to activate the final sequence. "Just press the button when the light turns green," she instructed. "It'll take about 2 minutes to fully seal the portal." 2 minutes, Harold repeated, gripping the device tightly. "Got it." As the others moved farther away, Harold took a step closer to the swirling vortex. The energy radiating from it was almost overwhelming, sending shivers down his spine. Yet he felt strangely calm, as if he were exactly where he was meant to be. Max barked once, his tail wagging weakly. Harold glanced over his shoulder and gave a small wave. "Goodbye, boy," he murmured. Then, taking another step forward, he pressed the button on the device. Instantly, the gateway began to shrink, its swirling colors intensifying as the sealing process began. Harold held the glowing flag high, using its light to guide him as the ground beneath his feet vibrated with energy. The wind picked up, whipping around him like a storm, but Harold stood firm. From a safe distance, Chuck, Rachel, and Daniel watched in silence. Max sat beside them, his ears perked up, staring intently at Harold's figure silhouetted against the bright light. None of them spoke. There was nothing left to say. Harold thought about his life as the seconds ticked by. He remembered the days, spent selling flags on the street corner, the laughter of teenagers mocking him, the loneliness that had weighed heavily on his shoulders. But he also remembered the moments of joy, the pride he felt in sharing something he believed in, the companionship of Max, and now, the friendships he'd formed with this unlikely team. For the first time in years, Harold felt peace. He wasn't just an old man anymore. He was part of something bigger, something extraordinary. And in these final moments, he realized that his life had always mattered, even when he couldn't see it himself. The gateway continued to collapse inward, growing, smaller and brighter with each passing second. Harold shielded his eyes with one hand, keeping the other raised high to hold the flag steady. The vibrations beneath his feet grew stronger, threatening to knock him off balance, but Harold refused to falter. Finally, with a deafening roar, the portal imploded, collapsing into a single point of blinding light before vanishing completely. The air fell silent and the world seemed to pause for a moment. When the light faded, Harold was gone. Back on the cliff, Chuck lowered his head, closing his eyes briefly in respect. Rachel wiped away her tears, clutching her laptop tightly. Daniel stared straight ahead, his expression unreadable but his fists clenched. Max let out a soft whimper, looking toward the spot where Harold had stood just moments ago. Chuck knelt down beside Max, patting him gently on the head. "He did what he had to do," Chuck said softly, "and he saved us all." Rachel sniffled, nodding. "We owe him everything. Without Harold, none of this would have been possible." Daniel cleared his throat, his voice rough with emotion. "Then we honor him, by making sure no one else tries to mess with something they don't understand." As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting golden light over the mountains, the group began their journey back down the trail. Max walked slowly beside Chuck, glancing back occasionally as if hoping Harold might reappear. Though Harold was gone, his legacy remained. The flags he had sold so passionately weren't just symbols of patriotism. They were reminders of courage, sacrifice, and the power of believing in something greater than oneself. And somewhere, in another dimension or perhaps, even within the hearts of those he left behind, Harold Jenkins stood tall, proud, and unafraid. The journey back down the mountain was quiet, each member of the group lost in their own thoughts. The sun climbed higher in the sky, its warmth spreading over the land, but it did little to ease the heaviness in their hearts. Harold Jenkins was gone, yet his presence lingered like an echo, reminding them of the bravery and selflessness he had shown. Chuck led the way, Max trotting faithfully beside him. The dog seemed to sense that something was different, his tail hanging low as he glanced up at Chuck occasionally. Rachel followed closely behind, her laptop tucked under one arm, her eyes red from crying. She kept replaying Harold's final moments in her mind, the way he had stood tall, holding the glowing flag like a beacon of hope until the very end. Daniel brought up the rear, his steps heavy but determined. He carried the weight of Harold's, sacrificed deeply, knowing that such acts were rare in this world. Though he didn't say much, his clenched fists and furrowed brow spoke volumes about the storm of emotions brewing inside him. When they reached the base of the mountain, Chuck stopped and turned to face the others. His expression was calm, but there was a sadness in his eyes that couldn't be hidden. "We need to honor Harold," he said simply. "Not just today, but every day moving forward." Rachel nodded, wiping away another tear. "He gave us a second chance, a chance to protect what matters most. We can't let his sacrifice go to waste." Daniel agreed, his voice gruff but sincere. "Harold showed us what real courage looks like. It's our job now to carry that torch," Max barked softly as if adding his agreement to the conversation. Chuck knelt down and scratched the dog behind the ears. "You're right, boy," he said with a small smile. "Harold wouldn't want us moping around forever. He'd want us to keep going, and that's exactly what we'll do." Over the next few days, the team worked together to ensure Vale Corp could never attempt anything like this again. Rachel used her skills to hack into the organization's systems, erasing all traces of the Gateway's existence and planting false information to throw them off track. Daniel dismantled the weapons and devices they had recovered during their battles, rendering them useless. And Chuck? He made sure word spread through his network of contacts, a warning to anyone who might try to exploit interdimensional technology in the future. Despite their efforts, none of them forgot Harold. Every evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, they would gather around a campfire and share stories about him. Rachel talked about how Harold's knowledge of symbols had helped crack the code on the flags. Daniel recalled the old man's unexpected act of bravery when he threw the wrench to create a distraction, and Chuck shared words of wisdom inspired by Harold's quiet strength. "He taught me something important," Chuck said one night, staring into the flames. "Heroes aren't always the loudest people in the room. Sometimes they're the ones, standing quietly in the corner, doing what's right even when no one is watching." Max lay curled up near the fire, his head resting on his paws. Occasionally, he would lift his ears as if listening for Harold's voice, but the silence remained unbroken. Still, the dog seemed content, knowing that Harold's memory lived on in those around him. Weeks later, the group decided it was time to part ways. Their mission was complete, and though they had formed a bond stronger than any of them expected, they knew they couldn't stay together forever. Before they left, Chuck called one final meeting. "We've done good work here," he began, looking at each of them in turn. "But the fight isn't over. There will always be people trying to misuse power for selfish gain. It's up to us to stand against them, just like Harold did." Rachel smiled faintly, clutching her laptop close. "I'll keep working behind the scenes," she said. "If anyone tries to mess with this kind of tech again, I'll know about it." "And I'll be ready," Daniel added, patting the rifle slung over his shoulder. "No one gets away with threatening innocent lives." Chuck nodded approvingly. Then he turned to Max, who wagged his tail eagerly. "As for you, buddy," Chuck said, scratching Max behind the ears, "you're coming with me. We'll make sure Harold's spirit stays alive wherever we go." With that, the group exchanged hugs and handshakes, promising to stay in touch. Rachel packed her things into a small car and drove off toward the city, her mind already buzzing with plans to expand her hacking network. Daniel loaded up his gear onto a motorcycle and revved the engine, disappearing down a dusty road toward parts unknown. Chuck and Max climbed into the black SUV, ready to continue their journey wherever it might lead. Months passed, and life moved on. Yet Harold's legacy continued to inspire those who had known him. Rachel became a leading figure in cybersecurity, using her talents to expose corruption and protect humanity from unseen threats. Daniel joined forces with underground resistance groups, training others to defend themselves against tyranny. And Chuck? He traveled the world, helping people in need and spreading the story of an old man who sold flags and saved the world. One day, while driving through a small town, Chuck noticed a familiar sight: a wooden stand set up on a street corner selling American flags. A young boy stood behind it, proudly explaining the meaning of the stars and stripes to passers-by. Chuck pulled over and stepped out of the SUV, smiling warmly. "These are great," he said to the boy, picking up one of the flags. "Where'd you get them?" "My grandpa gave them to me," the boy replied, beaming. "He said they're special." Chuck nodded, recognizing the truth in the boy's words. "Your grandpa sounds like a wise man," he said. "Keep sharing the message, okay?" The boy nodded enthusiastically, and Chuck handed him a few coins before climbing back into the SUV. As they drove away, Max barked happily, as if acknowledging the connection between this moment and the past. Chuck glanced at the dog and chuckled. "You're right, Max," he said. "Harold's still with us in more ways than one." And so the story of Harold Jenkins lived on, not just in the hearts of those who had fought alongside him, but in the countless lives he touched without ever knowing. His flags, once mocked and ignored, had become symbols of hope, courage, and unity. And though Harold himself was gone, his spirit soared high, carried by the winds of change across the world. In the end, Harold Jenkins proved that even the smallest actions could leave the biggest impact. From a lonely street corner to the edge of a dimensional gateway, he had shown everyone what it truly meant to be a hero.